Hi, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Professor Karam Dana, who is a professor at the University of Washington, Bothell. He studies political studies, Middle East studies, and he's a wonderful faculty member, and he's one of our distinguished teachers at the university. He's actually won a Distinguished Teaching Award, which is a really high honor for our faculty. He's done a really interesting and wonderful lecture, but at the heart of his lecture are a couple of videos, and I'm going to describe one as the donut video. So one is a donut video. The other is a video about hands. So and my question for you is, what is your reflection on either or both of those videos? What have you learned from either or both of those videos? So one is a video about donuts, kind of. Another is a video about hands. And my question to you is, what have you learned from these videos? Just your reflections, I think, is what I want to hear from either one or both of those videos. I hope everything is going well for you, and I hope you're keeping safe. Take good care.
Hello, everyone. My name is Karam Dana. I'm an associate professor in the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences at the University of Washington, Bothell. I teach courses related to the Middle East, the Arab world. I write about Palestine from 1920s onwards, contemporary Palestine and the effects of Israeli occupation on Palestinian society. And I also write on REP, race, ethnicity, and politics in the context of the United States, in particular in relation to American Muslims. I write and teach courses related to this. I'm very glad, in some ways, that I'm asked to give a talk, this particular lecture, in relation to 2020, the year. And I'm very honored to be asked to do this. But with this request that I was asked to do, I spent plenty of time thinking about what is it that I actually want to share. I know you've heard a lot about being resilient and thinking through this particular moment as one that will pass. And obviously it will not pass without much hardship, without much loss of life, pain and tears, and a lot of difficult times that we all have to deal with during this particular pandemic. But I would like to also, not only that, which I agree with, I also would like to mention that there are other ongoing issues that have continued to exist, other problems and difficult times that we've actually been living through. But in not only that we are continuously living through these particular predicaments, but these predicaments have actually intensified during the pandemic. And in some ways, I would like to share my own way of thinking through these difficult moments, but also kind of borrowing how I teach approaches to social research, which is a course that I teach to kind of think through knowledge, think about what you observe and how you can reflect upon what you are experiencing in your daily life. So the title of this presentation today will be Living Through Hard Times, Reflections and Lessons for Future Predicaments. But the interesting thing is that the word hard, living through hard times, it's in quotes. The word hard is in quotes. Because in some ways it represents that some people find it to be harder than others. And in some ways to kind of highlight the difficulty of even capturing the essence of the current situation we're living through. Living through hard times, reflections and lessons for future predicaments, it might be different from one person to another in terms of their own reflections and their own lessons. What I hope to do at the end of this presentation is for you to think about how hard has it been for you and what can you learn from these particular times, the pandemic, the social injustice that we live through in the United States, the economic inequality that is also in the United States and globally, and to kind of think about power at the center of all of this. So what I hope to do here is to think about, to help you think through various things related to how do we acquire knowledge, how do we reflect upon it, and how do we actually draw conclusions, be it for this particular predicament that we are living through, the year 2020. We're thinking about this as a time period, but in some ways there are events that begin and end, and some events continue to happen. So let us begin this presentation, if I may, and then I will elaborate moving forward. I also would like to mention, before we move forward, is that I have two short videos that in some ways highlight the way through which I have been able to see myself, to see my own limitations in reflection, okay, and in my own reflections in relation to things that I have lived through, right? That has helped me in some ways to think of how I should move forward, thinking about my own positionality in relation to problems or situations I face. Okay? So, if we are to observe the world around us today, at this very, very moment, we will see kind of a laundry list of things, right? And this isn't necessarily, as you can see in the PowerPoint presentation here, it's not necessarily to kind of have a laundry list of bad things that we are observing, but in some ways to address the pandemic, the global pandemic, that in some ways has disrupted every aspect of our lives, but to also situate it in a much larger processes that are also taking place throughout this particular pandemic, right? So there are social justice questions, racial hierarchy questions, structural racism continues to happen, and obviously the rampant racialization that we have seen exist in the United States, but also around the world, right? In addition to this, there are also questions of economic inequality, both domestic and global, right? We also observe environmental disasters. I mean, it's interesting. Yesterday I heard something on the radio that 2020 is going to be the hottest year on record. Obviously, we are going through a pandemic, but also this environmental problem is something we have to consider thinking about, right? Another thing on this laundry list, if I may, is violence against defenseless peoples from around the world. That has been a problem that has persisted for quite some time, obviously. To just take it into your consideration of how other people have lived around the world. What does it mean to live through violence and being subjugated to violence, and against defenseless population? What does that actually mean? Is something that we rarely, unfortunately, talk about these days. So let's talk more about alternative facts. The facts no longer matter. Is truth an important thing, or is it the alternative truth? Those things we are living through. And I'm putting kind of a question mark at the end, because not necessarily that I'm trying to provide an answer, except to say truth is truth. Alternative truths are not truths, basically, right? There are facts that we cannot deviate from. And then the very last thing that I'd like to highlight and talk about, obviously it's not new, but the so-called cultural clash, or the civilizational clash, or the famous hypothesis of the clash of civilizations. That seems to be more or less intensifying. And I also added a question mark, because I also, from my perspective, I question the idea of a clash of civilization. I think I have written in the past that it is more or less, if you always say that, cultures are different and they only see difference. But the way I see it is, if difference is all you see, difference is all you will continue to see. So I feel in some ways it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you frame it in a certain way, you will only see difference between civilizations. So here you have about 7 different things, and of course this list can go on or can be shorter. But I wanted to situate the global pandemic in a much larger world that is tumultuous, various things happening, different power structures operating around the globe, our interaction with the environment and Earth, our interactions with one another, our hierarchical situation in terms of racial hierarchy, economic hierarchy, that determines quite a bit of the world we live in, right? So, how should we think of these current crises? And I call them crises not necessarily to downplay the pandemic per se, but I think in some ways this particular way of thinking can help us think through other crises, other problems. So before I proceed, I'd like to also mention that this crisis, though very difficult and has really cost a lot of people people in terms of their own lives and relatives' lives, but also anguish and pain and tears and suffering. There's nothing, not to necessarily belittle that. But there are people around the world that actually live under similar conditions due to reasons other than the pandemic. So we have to also think about those things as we think about our own experiences in relation to the difficulties we are facing. So the first thing that I'd like to mention here is observation. Observe. Observe what you see. It's good to observe. We acquire knowledge from a variety of different channels, if I may. Sure, channels on television, but also we acquire knowledge from our parents, our grandparents. We acquire knowledge from a variety of angles, people we know, we come across in our life. So in some ways, our own unique perspective of the world is one that is very more or less specific to us. Yes, your own experiences can be similar to someone else, but at the same time, it's very difficult to see two people with identical experiences, with identical exposure to things around them throughout their lives. So observation is the very thing we go through. Now, the next thing that I suggest is to reflect upon your own observations. Obviously, nothing magical here. You observe, you reflect on it, and then you assess the situation, reorient, as I call it, or draw your own conclusions. Very simple, three-pronged approach to thinking about pretty much everything. But to think about this particular predicament, I want to slow down a little bit, right? Think about what would you tell people in the future, say young people in 30 years or 40 years, okay, who have not necessarily experienced a similar experience to you with regards to the pandemic. What would you tell them about this time period? Is it about COVID-19? Is it about Black Lives Matter movement? Is it about social and economic inequality in the United States? Is it about racial justice and or injustice? These moments of time are in some ways artifacts in by themselves. So it's interesting because a few years back, there's this little product, what I call her the digital genie, Alexa, right? You talk to Alexa and you ask, what time is it? Or, how's the weather today? The first question I asked Alexa, once we had one in our household, was how many people died during World War I and how many people died in World War II? And the numbers were astronomical. I mean, the numbers were in the millions. Now, not necessarily to belittle the number, but there's something to be talked about here, that we see life in numbers. We see stories in numbers. We see the idea that people have suffered through numbers and not necessarily through stories in by themselves. So what I hope here to do is to allow you to think about this particular moment in history as an artifact in by itself, right? So how do you, your own positionality today, right, or in this period, how do you see, how can you describe this in terms that can stay for a long time? How can they actually, in some ways, persist for a long time? Your descriptors of the situation. So imagine that you're telling this to your grandchildren, okay? Or you have lived to be 100 years old. How would you tell this to young people? How do you describe the situation? In some ways, we all have relatives who've gone through difficult situations, be it in the United States, living through, say, the Great Depression, right? Living through World War II in Europe, living through the Holocaust, living through the Palestinian Nakba and the displacement of Palestinian refugees, living through the internment camps in the United States for Japanese Americans, living through World War II, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. How does that actually, how are some of the stories? How are we capturing these stories? Every individual that has passed, for example, during these tragic events, has a story. How do we capture them? How can you tell? How can you describe this, right? So I just, again, it's kind of in the back of, keep that in the back of your mind in terms of what would you tell people in the future about this time period that you are living through, okay? Now, as I mentioned, I have two videos that I'd like to share. The first is an interesting little video. Again, it's kind of addressing the question of epistemology. How do we see things and filter them through our knowledge base and our brain and our minds, right? How do we actually interpret the world, right? And then to see whether or not we are accurate. So this is the first video I would like to share here. So what we learn from this little short video is that, our perceptions may not be accurate. That's the very first thing. But I also would like to highlight a couple of things here. Is that the narrator was telling a story in some ways about, that this guy looks homeless. Now, obviously, this guy looks also as a person of color. So how does our knowledge base in relation to people of color, in relation to the perception of homelessness, how did that actually play a role? And whether it did or not, I'm kind of assuming that that it played a role in terms of thinking about how we see and kind of judge in some ways, judge in this particular situation, judging the older man who is taking the donut, but he was in fact sharing it, right? Now, another quick video I'd like to share, if I may. And this video is a video that was produced by the Ministry of Information of Morocco to highlight invisible labor of... I'll leave this in a minute here, if I may. So, now, one thing you'll notice is that it's in a language you don't understand, and that's intentional. I want you to, in some ways, if I may, to see information, to observe information in language you don't understand, but also to see there are limits to what you know. That the world is not necessarily in English. The world can be in Arabic. The world can be in French, and it can be in a variety of other languages, right? So, so just observe with me, if I may. I typically, when I use this in my classrooms to kind of highlight certain things, is that, first of all, what do you think of it, and what is it about, and how much of the situation you understood without speaking the language? Because in some ways, a great deal of people don't understand, say, English, and then you in some ways expect those people to understand situations. So try to put yourself in some ways in their shoes, to understand their own difficult position they happen to find themselves into. Because just trying to figure out a short video might be a little bit challenging. Now, why are the men surprised at the very end? Well, here's the interesting part about this, is that those men were basically shown, as you can see, they were shown pictures of hands, and they were asked to describe whose hands do these belong to. And they were expecting, most of them expected that they were men who have difficult jobs, as carpenters, etc., farmers, and then they realized that it was women who are very close to them, their spouses, their mothers, their sisters, and their daughters in some ways. So they understood that their own knowledge of this situation, just looking at the picture, was not enough for them to even recognize that they belong to people who are very close to them. So what do we learn about knowledge without fully understanding the situation? Since most of you, I'm assuming here for a second, don't speak the language that was spoken in this short video. But also I can take that a little bit further. What do we learn from the fact that these men that were shown in this short video were unable to know that these hands, in fact, belong to women who were very close to them? So what that effectively tells us is that knowledge is not, no one has absolute knowledge. No one has absolute access to knowledge or knowing what is out there. So if I am able to kind of instill that as a way to think about the predicaments we're going through, that allows us to think, from my perspective, more analytically about the situation we're dealing with. So for those who want to know the full translation of the video, there it is here. in terms of how the men reacted to those women who they belong to. Okay, all right. So what can we learn from these videos? That your understanding, a person's understanding of what they see and observe, may not be accurate. And that your own biases, I mean, in the case of the first video of the donuts, that one's own biases of homelessness and a person of color might in fact play a role in terms of how you interpret what you see. Whereas the white man wearing a tie and a suit being a bit uncomfortable with a person across from him eating the donuts that he thought belonged to him. Now, more of that. Let's just dig a little bit deeper here. Without understanding the full context of what you are observing, okay, you are bound in some ways to have inaccurate conclusions. This is more or less inevitable as far as I'm concerned. The world is not only in English, as we learned from the Hands video, which means that your linguistical and potentially analytical abilities and tools of understanding the world are actually quite limited. So language matters, context matters. To just take those into consideration as we're thinking about, when I think about the pandemic and what it means to me, I'm unable to understand oftentimes how others are going through this. And it might be difficult for me, but it might be a lot more difficult for others. So the question here is to look at your own, or the kind of the important part here from my perspective is to look at your own experience in some ways in relation to other people's experiences, to look at your own suffering in relation to other people's sufferings, and to understand your suffering through other people's suffering. And that, in other words, we can call that potentially empathy in some ways, right? So to be empathetic as you are even thinking through the world. Now, what matters when we observe and reflect? See, when we reflect, we tend to think about what we know already in terms of our own knowledge base. But I would like to also say, okay, we observe and we have to be analytical as we are reflecting and understand the limitations of our reflection. But how do we reorient our own position, our own read of the situation, right? Now, one thing, as I said earlier in relation to World War I, how many people died, lost their lives during World War I and World War II. Sure, aggregate numbers matter. You know, how many people have died due to COVID-19 in the United States? 250,000 people and counting. But what we are leaving here, we're leaving out details, and in some ways richness of individual experiences, which are very significant because they tell us the nuance. Think about how many stories were never told, that we could actually, as humanity, be very benefit from knowing these stories. So in some ways, although numbers matter, individual experiences matter as well, and it provides us with the nuance. Now, I also would like to highlight that the ability and space, and by space I mean opportunity, not necessarily physical, but the opportunity for people, in particular people of color, to narrate their own story, in some ways gives power to these stories, and not only that, gives power to how we think of the world, and our own take of the world. So having one's ability and the opportunity to speak about their own story is very significant, as opposed to someone else telling them their story, right? Now, kind of consistent with what I've mentioned earlier, your own reactions as an individual to what you live through and experience differs greatly to another person's experiences, right? So you have to understand that as well and kind of put that in how we think about dealing with our world, the difficult 2020, the year 2020. And then it leads me to the idea of that identity, your own individual identity matters, and your experiences, and something quite significant, the idea of your own positionality. Where do you find yourself in relation to a particular situation matters. How do you describe it matters. Where do you stand The experiences of single mothers during COVID-19 is very different than someone who's a CEO of a company that is selling hand sanitizers. I'm just saying, it's very different. So it's the same condition, but they are very different. So the positionality of someone who's underprivileged, okay, matters. And we have to take that into consideration in terms of thinking about how do we address future predicaments. Now, thinking through all of these aspects, I think one thing I'd like to highlight personally is that history should be more relevant than ever today, right? We should learn from our previous experiences. We should learn from things that have happened in the past. And we should consider thinking about these particular moments we're living through as history in some ways, right? As history that we should learn from, okay? And then truths and facts. Truths, the truth in terms of science, what COVID-19 is and isn't, whether the numbers are going up or down. It also in some ways highlights certain things about our own society, unfortunately. And we should not necessarily think of alternative facts as important at all, as far as I'm concerned. There are facts that we cannot deviate from, and facts should take center stage. Okay. Now, moving forward, my own personal humble advice, always try to be critical, observe, reflect, and draw, knowing that your conclusions are limited. Draw your own limited conclusions. Now, pandemic-related hardships are not equally felt, unfortunately. Privilege matters. Structural racism has exacerbated. You find that 1 in every 5 or 6 black families, black or Latinx families in the United States are food insecure. So there are problems here. Economic inequality persists in the U.S., especially under COVID-19 situations. You find different places in the United States whereby 1 in every 1,000 people in those locales have died due to COVID-19. Yes, this pandemic will most likely pass, but not without cost. Obviously, as I mentioned, lost lives, hardship of all sorts, economic, financial, losing people, having persistent health problems, etc. Tears and pain and suffering more than ever. Yes, but I also would like to highlight that some crises will continue and others will emerge. So what have we, you individually, collectively, how have we as a community, as a society, in the United States, what have we learned about our own communities? What have we learned about how we see other people from around the world? What have we learned from this pandemic that we can use in the future? I provide you no solutions, unfortunately, but what I provide here, I hope, is a way to think about this predicament in ways that can be helpful for us moving forward, dealing with our persistent problems. And let's hope 2020 will end with a lot less suffering, and that 2021 will be a lot more positive for all of us. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. It's such a pleasure for me to have this conversation and to introduce you to Professor Karam Dana, who is a professor at the University of Washington in Bothell. And I want to talk about his teaching. I want to talk about his video. He's an exceptional teacher, an exceptional researcher. Welcome and thank you, Karam, for spending the time with us, Dr. Dana.
Thank you very much, Ed. I'm very delighted to be here, and thank you for the invitation.
Now, before we start talking about your video and your presentation, I want to talk about you and your experience at the University of Washington. You did your undergraduate degree, you did your master's degree at the University of Washington, and you did your Ph.D. And before you came here, talk to the students in the audience about why you chose the University of Washington and how you came to your passion about political studies, about Middle Eastern studies, and Reconstruction after conflict.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Ed. It's interesting because I feel that my own journey is one that is reflected best through my career at the University of Washington. I moved from the Palestinian territory of the West Bank, from Al-Khalil, Hebron, after high school to the Pacific Northwest. I've had family in the area. And in some ways, I realized that if I wanted education in my life, I would never be able to get it under such difficult circumstances. And by difficult, I mean constant checkpoints, difficulties to go from one city into another, constant violence, military roaming the streets. So I realized that if I wanted to, in some ways, work on myself, and primarily working on my own personal thinking, progress, kind of like to progress in some ways in terms of my own thinking and to be able to acquire the best possible knowledge, I needed to leave. So the US was kind of a natural place for me. Obviously, I'm very privileged to be able to come to the United States. Not so many people are able to come to the US. Not to say that the US is in some ways, the most perfect place in the world, but it allowed me an opportunity that I would not have had in other ways. So I came to the Pacific Northwest. I had siblings who had gone to Evergreen, to different places within the Pacific Northwest. And I first went to a community college. I went to what then was known as the Seattle Central Community College. Now the community word is dropped now, Seattle Central College. And Seattle Central was in some ways my entry point into understanding the true American experience. And by that, I mean that there are actually poor people in the United States, because the present representation of people outside the US is one that isn't necessarily accurate. That also that the questions surrounding how African Americans live and interact in the United States are very different than ones that you see on television outside the United States. I mean, I recall that Boys in the Hood was basically you want to know anything about Black African Americans, Boys in the Hood is it. One person is really, really bad and one person really wants to try to be good, but at the end of the day loses their life. So in some ways, it's very unidimensional and in fact, insulting, one can think, right? I mean, in a number of ways, it's just, that is not a representation in some ways. So Seattle Central was a kind of an entry point into me understanding, I would call it kind of an alternative against the grain American society and politics, right? And I was a reader already to begin with. I was reading a hell of a lot throughout my life, both in multiple languages, but I couldn't really experiencing things and living through it as something else. So Seattle Central was very instrumental, I feel. I am a community college person, right? Like I advocate for community college in every possible way I can. So then I transferred. I mean, one more thing I want to mention about Seattle Central is that I also understood socioeconomic inequality in ways that was not even talked about or represented. I'm talking about particularly the WTO events, the World Trade Organization's protest. And I understood that in some ways, democratic countries and democratic states actually do use violence quite a bit against their own populations. From what I have observed, at least, I realized that a lot has gone wrong in terms of my own perception of what the so-called America was. So that was my entry point. Then I transferred to the University of Washington soon after. And it's interesting because I met my spouse, Sharon, who we actually met at Seattle Central. We were in classes together, but we first met at the University of Washington. It was our second quarter there. And in some ways, I had someone with me and she had someone with her for us to share experiences as someone who grew up in the Pacific Northwest in her case, whereas in my case as a person who's an immigrant who came from a faraway place that tends to be misrepresented, that tends to be thought of as a violent world, right? That tends to be thought of as you're suspicious in some ways. So in some ways I'm pretty used to being racialized, right? So that's one thing. And it allowed me in some ways to kind of navigate the University of Washington experience and for me to find answers to my own experiences that I found extremely valuable at UW. I've had a connection to the University of Washington now for about 20 years with some kind of minimal time in between. The reason why I went to political science and economics was for me to understand how do different processes in the world work. And I wanted in some ways to see a better future for places that have been plagued with violence, have been plagued by occupation and colonization, places that have been plagued by apartheid, places that have been plagued by institutional racism that is fully accepted by the political structures. So in some ways that allowed me to I gravitated towards political science. I gravitated towards economics to see, okay, well, economics matters. Okay, political science matters, and political economy. And then after which I finished my degree, my undergraduate. And then I immediately went into the Jackson School of International Studies for a master's degree in Middle East Studies. And I, as you mentioned in the introduction, I studied reconstruction in some ways in post-conflict periods. So I studied in some ways, how do we think of Palestinian society in what everyone was more optimistic than? I mean, well, somewhat optimistic. So I wanted in some ways to think about how can we make sure that there's an infrastructure that works? How do we make sure that the economy works? How do we make sure that the political establishment works? So I studied how we figure that out. And then I moved on for the Ph.D., the Interdisciplinary Ph.D. in Near and Middle Eastern Studies. And this is, I want to actually highlight this. In some ways, I think my way of thinking about the world is interdisciplinary, because I see something that affects my life that has made me, in some ways, think about it from not one or two angles. I mean, oftentimes you hear people say, like, every story has two sides. I actually fully disagree. Every story has infinite amounts of sides, because every positionality in some ways, it's not only it's kind of, oftentimes what people think about is they think of the world in a binary sense, black or white. Okay, they think about dark or night and day, but they don't necessarily think about the infinite amounts of shades, if I may, in between, right? Like, we don't think about what is the experience of someone watching the two people fighting, for example. What do we talk about? So there's a whole lot of infinite positions and angles through which we study a situation. So interdisciplinary learning was key for me. And I studied Palestinian elite and its connections to society from the 1920s onwards, the interwar period between World War I and World War II.
That's a perfect answer, Dr. Dana, in part because I want to come back to this comment that you made about being a young man and moving across borders. And it makes sense that as a professor, that your work is interdisciplinary, because those intellectual borders, moving across those borders, matter to you. And also, a good percentage of our students at Seattle and Bothell and Tacoma are transfer students. The path to the university is not always a straight line. And your story is such a beautiful story that helps us understand the power of what we can do, no matter where we come from. You chose as a title for your talk, Living Through Hard Times, Reflections and Lessons for Future Predicaments. You think about big predicaments, you think about global predicaments. Tell us why you chose this title for 2020.
It's interesting. You and I, Dr. Taylor, we've talked about those types of predicaments in the past. We sat down and we had long conversations about how do we, in some ways, think about the problems of the world and how do we solve them? And it's not a one way, there isn't one way to answer things. How do we think about the complexity of things? Why did I choose this title? I chose it in some ways because I feel that experiences teach us something. Okay, any experience we go through, difficult or not so difficult, in some ways has the potential of us to learn something. I think if you think about, and I don't want to necessarily make this a much bigger issue here, but rather if you think about humanity, we build on knowledge as we move forward in life, right? We build on different theoretical understandings about astrophysics, and we move forward in scientific inquiry. We think about how we understand socioeconomic challenges, and we figure out ways to move forward. But so knowledge is it's not a one-time shot. It's built on, it's a process, right? It's a continuum in some ways. It keeps going in some ways. But also, in order for someone to be able to produce knowledge, they need to understand what has been talked about it previously. So I think the way I see this, I have lived through predicaments in my life. I've lived under, as I mentioned, under Israeli occupation. So my life was difficult. I have been targeted because of my Palestinianness in some way, the fact that I happen to be an Arab Palestinian, indigenous Arab Palestinian, living on my own lands. Yet the circumstances of this universe has allowed me in some ways to be subjugated to treatment that is not fair, right? That is not fair by the standards that anyone can actually think about. I mean, my human rights have been violated in my life. So what do I do about that? I mean, in some ways, the reactions to these these types of actions are different, right? The reactions are different from one person to another. My reaction was to educate myself more, to understand things better. Why do people do certain things in a certain way? Now, for example, the predicaments we live through, where we're talking about violence perpetrated against Black and brown bodies, for example, in the United States, but also globally. I mean, this is not necessarily that something that only happens in the US, yet it is very important to stress the significance of this in the United States, without a doubt. Black Lives Matter is a very important movement, and we have to always back it up from my perspective. But similar types of struggles have happened around the world. South Africa, Gaza, West Bank, obviously the Palestinian question here, and then other places. I mean, in Yemen, people have been dying for quite some time, and people living in various places throughout the world, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. And the list goes on. And it's not necessarily, as I mentioned in my talk, it's not necessarily to have a laundry list of bad things that are happening in the world, but in some ways it is, because these are challenges that we need to overcome. So from my perspective, I chose this title in some ways for us to reflect. And I think a great deal of what I do is actually stop and think. And I think in some ways there's a privilege to that, right? To be able to stop and think about what you have learned, what have you read, what have you thought of, and to kind of reflect upon it and to say, like, what are the teaching moments moving forward? So one thing that really stands out here is that everyone, from my, observing people around me, everyone in some ways was pretty stressed in relation to the lockdown, the shutdown, right? Like, okay, no restaurants, no bars, none of those things, please, and everyone in some ways was very, very frightened by this. And not necessarily to belittle this per se. Obviously, this is a new thing that people are not experienced, they have not experienced, but I have. And in some ways, I follow, in some ways, the recommendations of my health superior, right? So I listen to the Department of Health of Washington State, because I understand what they're doing, and I understand it's important. And I also understand the alternative in some ways. Sure, in health aspect, but I also, from my perspective, I've experienced these similar situations that allowed me to make sure that I take care of myself. I take care of myself at this very critical moment. So how do we move forward is something we learn today. How do we move forward in dealing with other predicaments?
You chose a couple of what I thought were very powerful videos. And I won't talk about the content of the video because I want those who watch the talk to pay attention to the videos and discover what they want to discover from them. I found the videos powerful in one sense that I started watching them and I wasn't paying full attention, the first one. And I had to reel back again and realize that I think what you wanted me to do was really give my full attention, to not have other things going on, but really give full attention to this. So I started again and I sat myself up and I thought, let me just really pay attention to both of these videos. And I've been thinking about them since I watched them. Tell me why you chose videos in this case and why you chose the videos that you did. And we'll save the content for the students to actually pay attention to it.
Thank you. If I got Dr. Taylor's attention, I've made it. Thank you. So these are two little short videos that I use in my class, as I mentioned. I'm really interested in questions of epistemology, right? I don't necessarily study epistemology, but rather, in a sense, how do I challenge knowledge that is inaccurate? How do I challenge knowledge that is actually off? I mean, as I mentioned repeatedly, right? I mean, I've been racialized because I happen to be Palestinian. I walk down the street, people think that I'm white. But then it's funny because I write this statement, I've written it a couple of times. People think I'm white. I mean, in the United States, people think I'm white until they know I'm not. And in some ways that kind of resonates with a lot of people, because your family history, your experiences play a role in terms of how you are seen by others. So these two little short videos are ones that in some ways highlight our own misperceptions about people that we can read. We look at a situation and we feel that we're able to read what is in that situation. But these two videos actually challenge your own notion of what you know about this situation. And I think it does it in a very simple way that it highlights that we actually know very little. And if anything, if I may, it teaches us that what we know can also be subject. Anything that we know can be problematic. And again, I'm not necessarily to say that everything we know is wrong, but we always have to keep thinking about what we know. We always have to make sure that what we know is it true or is it not? And also be open to changing our opinions, be open to changing our read of the world. But there's one of the two videos that is in a foreign language that you don't understand. And I mentioned that, like, well, why is this guy doing this to us? And it's not necessarily a moment of punishment, but rather in the sense to actually also mention that the world is not in English, as I say, right? The world isn't in English. The world is complicated. Though, as you mentioned, there isn't one path of experience. There's so many languages to life. There's so many different experiences that are animated by life, by experiences, by language, by context, by socio-political comfort, by socio-economic conditions. So there's a complex situation there to talk about. So this is the reason why I chose this. And if I usually give my students one thing in that class is just remember that everything you know might actually be wrong. That is actually a very important advice I have found in the past. In particular, I have a professor who unfortunately passed last year, Ellis Goldberg from political science. He taught me in some ways that it's a very good idea to read books of people you don't like, And I said, why would I do that? He's like, because you actually learn a lot from people you don't like. And in some ways, I've actually come to appreciate that in my life. In addition to actually, it allowed me in some ways to challenge my own thinking about things that I know to be, of course, but actually, when I read people's ideas, whose ideas I don't like, it challenges my own way of seeing my own ideas. So may he rest in peace, Ellis. He was a very deep thinker in some ways, and I feel in some ways I've gotten that from him. So these are the reasons why I chose those videos, because they highlight that. And in some ways, there's racialization is all around us. I mean, the reason why I use the word racialization, because in one of the two videos, there's also a person who, I don't want to mention much. I hope students and those who are looking at this will be able to see it for themselves. But that person seems to be darker. There are two people, one of whom is upper middle class, seems to be upper middle class person who happens to be white male. And then the other person seems to be of a lower socioeconomic class, at least from how one reads it, how the average person reads it, and also darker. So how does race in some ways play into us reading situations? Kind of implicit biases? Is it, how do we actually pinpoint these implicit biases, if we have any? But in some ways, those two videos highlight some of those things for people to ask questions of themselves. But yeah.
Hi, everybody. We're back again with Dr. Karam Dana. And such as 2020, we had internet problems the last time we met. So we're doing a part 2 of our video, which is part and parcel of the lives that we're living right now and the ways in which we're teaching. So thank you for coming back again.
Thank you very much.
I wanted to pick up on something that is important to your work and important to your teaching, which is this concept of embracing and looking at suffering. You invite your students to look at their own suffering. Mm-hmm. And your research is built around understanding the suffering of others. Talk about that in your teaching and in your research, that concept of suffering.
Thank you. Well, I think in some ways, if a person is able to look at their own suffering and understand it, first of all, understand the kind of the power structure as to why they were, in some ways, people who were recipients of suffering, if I may. And then that's one thing. And then be able to kind of reflect that sort of understanding on everything else around them. Look at other folks, other people, be it individual or be it groups in the sense. They will understand that suffering in terms of their own suffering. This is in some ways what I've been kind of the basic pedagogical way of me kind of handling my own courses. I think part of my, what is known as quote unquote success, part of my success in teaching, I think has to do with the fact that I'm able to get students to understand who they are in relation to others and understand their, other people's sufferings in terms of their own suffering. And in some ways, I think it not only transcends in terms of the teaching, but it also obviously is very integral part in terms of my own research. Right after 9/11, I wasn't necessarily studying American Muslims. I was studying Palestinian politics from the 1920s on. But 9/11 in some ways necessitated kind of my own understanding and my own view of how Islam and Muslims live in the United States. I happened to be Muslim American and I was a college student around then. So in some ways, I felt that there was a great deal of nuance that was missing. So I felt that I needed to study that. And in some ways, a lot of people ask, was your projection kind of going into a master's degree in this particular area of study? Was that natural or not? And I think in some ways I was shoved into it because there was a necessity that was there. Now, the basic fundamental thing for my research is I basically look at how people see themselves in relation to different policies that affect their own identities, in a nutshell, be it in Palestine, be it Palestinians living transnationally, or be it American Muslims, which is one of the two fundamental areas of research that I conduct. So I study, for example, whether a person who happens to be Muslim is or isn't able to live in a context like the United States. So I was one of the first people to study the so-called compatibility. Can being a good Muslim, both religiously or one identifying as Muslim, and I'll explain that in a little bit, whether or not that makes them more capable of actually participating in American politics and civically engaged in the context of their own communities and their own in American society in general. So I think their own individual experiences, Muslim Americans, transcends in some ways to other people's experiences and kind of that comparable natural comparison that takes place between the two in people's own minds, but also collectively within a community. So I really fundamentally think that there is a basic connection between all people in some ways. We all happen to have relationships with our siblings, with our parents, with our neighbors, etc. But the context of the US and the various policies, both transnational and local and international politics, affects how American society, for example, interacts and defines certain type of people. So, for example, I'm just going to give an example, if I may. Like, I've had it's funny, about a decade or so ago, I was based on the East Coast, but I had big connections, family, and my significant other was living in the Seattle area. So I was flying back and forth quite regularly. And one time I had finished giving a lecture where I was teaching then at Harvard University. And I, straight from my kind of, teaching attire, I was kind of dressed up, right? And I went straight to the airport because I had a flight to catch. And I flew out and I was upgraded to first class because I was a frequent flyer. There was this wonderful lady, what I thought was a wonderful lady right next to me, who basically said, "What do you do? You're all dressed up. What do you do?" I said, "I'm a professor." And, she said, "Oh, that's interesting. And what do you teach? What do you?" And I explained what I study and what I research about American Muslims. And then I couldn't have said anything that could have made her more fearful at that particular minute, right? And we were on a flight. I mean, we were on an airplane, 30-some thousand feet flying, towards the West Coast. And then she said, "I think, the interesting thing about you people, is that I cannot understand you." is that you are all nice and smiley and all that. You could have planted a bomb on this airplane at this very second. And that was quite fearful to me. And in some ways, it motivated me to move forward, to actually provide more ways for people to understand and kind of actually self-correct their own misconceptions, first of all. And to understand the suffering of American Muslims, African Americans, Asian Americans, and obviously the list goes on. And different types of communities have their own challenges, but to understand that the suffering of these communities is quite similar to their own. So I don't know, that's a long answer to your very simple question.
That conversation changes in a moment when you identify what it is you study, and then you become the other sitting there in the seat next to her. For you, Dr. Dana, religious identity is important, the study of religious identity. And that's different for you than religiosity as we come into the holiday season. Mark the difference between religious identity and why that's important to you and religiosity. What's the difference between you?
No, I think it's interesting. A lot of people, when they watch the news about religion, right? I mean, religion and politics in general, be it Protestant Christianity, or be it Catholicism, or be it any version, any color, if I may, or any kind of version of Christianity. If you happen to be Jewish, if you happen to be Muslim, if you happen to be with any kind of religious belief that one has. A lot of people don't understand the nuances of religiosity, first of all, and then, as you mentioned, and then the idea of religious identity, right? Identity is in some ways, it's an identifier that a person carries, right? Simply to say, I happen to be a Muslim. In some ways, it signals a particular community. It signals a particular set of belief systems, right? So that's on one side. Whereas religiosity is a bit more complex, and in some ways, it's something we can actually measure, right? I mean, we can measure what is known as the 3 B's of religiosity, 3 B's, right? Believing. You believe in a particular story about, wrong or, accurate or inaccurate is irrelevant, for our, not necessarily to insult anyone, but rather to say, there are stories, that there's a belief in these stories. So believing in a particular story and a text, for example. You believe that the Quran and the Hadith are important in Islam, for example. You believe that the New Testaments, the Old Testament matter if you happen to be Christian, et cetera, et cetera. So believing. And the other is behaving. What are certain type of things that you have to do? Very list of things that you have to do. If you happen to be Muslim, a good Muslim, quote unquote, would pray 5 times a day, according to that particular religion, right? If you happen to be a good Christian, you go to church and you live your life by what would Jesus do, more or less, right? So these are the doing things, the behaving, right? So there's, as I mentioned, it's believing in a particular text, a story, the holy text, scripture. And then behaving, you behave in a certain way, right? You pray 5 times a day. If you happen to be Muslim, you fast. If you happen to be Jewish, you observe Shabbat, etc. Right? And then the third is belonging, which I think is a quite important thing to remember here, because it signals a community in some ways. You feel that your own identity, your own belief system, is somewhat matches some other group of people. And there's a great deal of research that has been done about what does religion and politics do to communities, right? In particular, the Black American community, African American community, the role of the church has been quite significant in helping effectively and mobilizing various events that led to the civil rights movement. So the role of the church, the Black church, has been an extremely important played a very important role in kind of catalyzing this community. Not necessarily that the community did not, but rather to say that there's a moment where people come together. They have they have quite similar types of views about the world, about the world, and then it comes together where a moment of conversation takes place. So belonging is important. So believing is the first thing. Behaving, and then belonging. Belonging, it really is where most of my work takes place, right? How does one see themselves in relation to other people living and sharing that particular identity? So the three B's are what is known as religiosity. Someone needs in some ways to feel that they are part of a community, behaving in a certain way, and also believing in a particular narrative, right? So so these are, in a nutshell, the differences between a religious identity and religiosity, which I think a lot of people don't necessarily see the nuance, because if someone says, as you pointed out, that very nice lady on the airplane, all she needed to know is that I basically identified myself as American Muslims, and that was enough for her to judge me, in a sense, in the worst possible sense. So there's a great deal of misinformation there, unfortunately.
We are close at this point as we enter into December of 2020. We're close. A vaccine is near, and hopefully the pandemic will be behind us. And as you mentioned in your lecture, we will be different because of this pandemic. But let me take this concept, final question of belonging, Dr. Dana, given that the breadth of your work, not just in the United States, but in the world, but this concept of belonging, are you as a scholar and a teacher and as a person, are you hopeful that one of the lessons that we will learn post 2020 is that belonging is actually important? It's a concept that's important around the world, that bridging across borders and creating a sense of belonging. Are you hopeful that we will get to a place of deeper understanding as a result of this year?
You know, it's interesting. I sometimes pause and think of that very same point, right, that you're raising, because I do see various forms of connections that are being made, that communities are being strengthened, and in some ways they're working together to weather this, what we perceive as unprecedented crisis, obviously. So you find different people coming together in ways that they haven't before, which I sincerely see as inspiring, right? But I also, at the same time, I also see nationalism in some ways, whereby to say, well, wait a second, resources should not be allocated in this way or another. So various nationalistic feelings. Now, not necessarily that's not in some ways common. It has been common for quite some time that nationalist feelings and in some ways dictate how people behave, etc. But up to a point, I think we live in a time, we live in an era in some ways whereby we see a clash day in and day out between new ideas that try to break down barriers and walls, if I may. And a wall doesn't have to be physical, right? I mean, it's interesting. People who study walls, they tell you walls are not effective if that's what you want to do. But rather the physical wall, but also the metaphorical wall. I mean, you can always have a conversation and put a wall and not listen to anything the other person is saying. That happens all the time. I mean, we see this every single day at the grocery store. We see it, literally. I mean, just as an example in the grocery store, but it can be happening everywhere, at homes, in classrooms, etc. So I do see people try to break down walls, but I also at the same time see people who are fearful of change, whereby they would rather keep a wall or actually build a different kind of wall. Look, I'm optimistic, but at the same time, I also am worried about what is happening, not only in the United States, but globally in terms of allocation of resources. And specifically, for example, when we talk about the vaccine, how will the vaccine be actually distributed to the developing world, the world that doesn't have resources? And oftentimes the argument goes, well, the market should decide. Okay, fine, I understand the argument, but it doesn't mean that I agree with the argument. Because in some ways, if we ask the question, why are these countries in the current situation that they're in unable to have, the developed developed industries, developed technologies, et cetera? And almost more often than not, it has to do with colonialism. It has to do, in some ways, with how the developed world dealt with its so-called now the developing world. So we need to understand, take the big picture, and have a memory that is longer than basically than just simply a decade or two, but to actually put things in a larger context, and also understand, as far as I'm concerned, that your own experiences are really unique to you, but at the same time, they can be ones that, as I mentioned, comparable and in some ways understandable by other people. I think, for example, everyone who has lost someone to cancer, literally anywhere in the world, they understand that suffering. Okay, they somehow have something to bond through. And I'm not necessarily saying like, oh, let's get everyone and put them all together, but rather in some ways to just individually understand that building a community doesn't take a lot. But it also, breaking down a community also doesn't take a lot. So am I optimistic? Yes. Anecdotes of positive connections and belonging to communities are happening. But anecdotes, I'd rather have them actually more as the norm rather than anecdotes. So I'm still optimistic.
Dr. Dana, thank you for being the scholar that you are, the teacher that you are, and the leader that you are. I'm grateful for your participation in the course. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. I'm very delighted to be part of this, and 2020 will be over soon. So
It will.
Thank you.